So today I am going to be reacting to a video of the comedian Marc Maron speaking about a particular topic around comedy. This is an experiment. I want to see how well this kind of reaction video works. But when I was watching it, I definitely had some feelings, and I thought this would be probably the best way to sort of discuss that. So, without further ado, I'll be commenting on the video and showing it to you as well. So, all for educational purposes, of course.
Point, it's lazy and sloppy and hackneyed. To be in a fucking club where, I walking down the hall at the comedy club, at the comedy store, and, in one room, someone's doing their bit about trans people. And then I get down the hall and there's someone on stage going, well, I guess I got to do my bit about trans people. Like, no, you don't. You don't. It's hack now. I mean, you guys got the freedom you wanted. You can now say whatever you want. They're defeated. Their rights have been denied. The policies that you guys encouraged with your stupid material are now policy. And now, like, half the people under the umbrella of anti-woke, we've lost a tremendous amount of democratic leaning ideas and movements. So whether they knew it or not, that's what they were spearheading. So now it's reality, and you want to still keep kicking them?
So, on this particular point, um, I think there are areas, without necessarily going into whether he's correct about the full loss of rights, which clearly they have lost ground in terms of certain kinds of rights. But putting that aside, because I don't want to get into this whole debate, I want to focus more on his point about essentially he's saying these comedians are kicking people when they're down, right? And it's hack comedy because you're just picking the lowest common denominator sort of thing. Everyone's doing it. Okay, let's make fun of the trans people, that sort of thing. And I think I would have to sort of agree with him here. There is there's a reason why it was kind of the sacred cow to talk about any trans issues. People were afraid to. And there was a point in which you can say anything without facing quite serious consequences. And in that way, I guess you could say, well, that makes sense for comedy or for comedians to approach that topic because we should be able to talk about everything, make fun of everything. And if there's something that we can't, um, that means that that means that that has power. And I think that's certainly the case to some extent, but I think a lot of things get lumped together. So with the trans issues, I think it's a lot of the kind of radical activism that did have power because it had the power to maybe have people lose their jobs or the mob going after you. And then at the same time, you have a group of people who are actually very disenfranchised, who are discriminated against. Um, and, comedy ideally should be knocking down power, right? Those with power, institutions, governments. And there's a significant difference between sort of maybe mocking the radicals who did have an amount of power versus like the individuals who very often have very little power. And it's like you're kicking someone down. And especially now, what Mark is kind of saying is that, well, the tide has turned so much that these are people who the little power that they might have had for a time, they don't really have it anymore, right? Because they're losing rights. And therefore, you're basically kicking a dog, right? And when it's down, not comparing trans people to a dog, but I'm just saying that it's this like idea that instead of you're kicking, you're picking on a soft target, you are being the bully in the name of comedy, but really when you could have other material. So he's calling them a hack because, well, they are hacks in the sense that uh, they're resorting to sort of the lowest common denominator kind of comedy. Like everybody's making fun of trans people. Okay, okay, got it. We heard it, right? Um, so I think I would tend to agree with him on this particular point.
Go
No,
ahead.
I don't know that the comedians have had that much power,
Are
and
you fucking out of your mind?
no, I'm being
Yeah,
serious.
Joe Rogan. I'm not gonna
No,
go.
go ahead, go ahead.
It's not that the comedians alone are are in charge or have all the power, but they're part of culture, and culture has a lot of influence. So he probably shouldn't be diminishing that role of comedians. And Mark, he brings up Rogan right away, which I don't think is like quite a fair, because he's bringing him up kind of as a comedian, but it's really like a podcaster, and that's where he has his power. This is where he has his influences as a podcaster, not necessarily comedian, but let's keep watching.
You can't separate. Like if the movement is like, we're being censored. No, you're not. You're not. There's no constitutional censorship issue with your free speech. You say things, and in a democratic shit show of an environment, like Twitter or whatever, there's cultural pushback. And I'm not saying that it wasn't, it was pretty bad in terms of people getting canceled and stuff, and I agree that was an issue, but that's a specific issue. To frame it as some sort of free speech problem was a misdirect. It wasn't a free speech problem. It was that people were getting cultural pushback. That is not a constitutional issue. No one was being put in jail for saying anything. That's a free speech issue.
So I think actually here Mark does make a very, very good point. And he acknowledges that, the cultural pushback of cancel culture or always being referred to as woke, that is something that had an impact and probably had gone too far. I mean, in my opinion, it certainly has gone too far, but it is separate from the rules around like what free speech is, which is really your protected right to speak without the government infringing on it. And I've been asked before on podcasts, like, which do I consider worse, the cultural side of it, like cancel culture, or the suppression of speech by government tools. And my answer has been the government suppression of speech is the worst because you have a government mechanism, which means that you can be imprisoned, right, for your speech. You can be punished for your speech, and it's about your rights. Those get taken away. And I think often the two are so conflated, but I think it's an important distinction. So, right now, around the world, we have so many governments that are suppressing people's free speech legally. And those are right wing governments, those are left wing governments. It's happening all over the world. We're seeing it right now in the UK with the Online Safety Act, in Canada, in Ireland, in Germany. I mean, and you can agree or disagree with it, but that's what's happening. Um, versus culture, I don't wanna diminish it because obviously I think the cultural suppression of speech is incredibly important, and in fact, I see the 2 as tied together because if you empower people to a point where they're culturally targeting people for their speech, especially when it's, minor transgressions, minor disagreements, and for that, there's, like, this large penalty, you're creating a condition by which it means that ultimately it paves the road for governments to then use legal powers to restrict speech and understand that their constituents aren't really going to stand up to that because culturally they've been conditioned to suppress that speech. Same with, maybe in the private sector. So I don't see the two as entirely separate things, but ultimately, if a government is taking away your rights to speech, which we're seeing again, oh, and I forgot, of course, also in the US. Um, when you take away those rights and there is a governmental mechanism by which you can be punished and punished by either fines or being imprisoned, that is a much more severe step on the ladder of censorship. Mark might see the two as entirely separate. I see them as not quite entirely separate. But certainly, when you take somebody's rights away through legal mechanisms, we're living in a much more dangerous place in that regard.
But my problem is you're gonna start talking about anti-woke, and that's going to be your point of view. That's gonna be your ideological, grounding for what you do. Okay, that's fine, but why does it have to be the same 4 fucking things? It's like they talk about the same shit, and I don't know a better definition of hack. I mean, after a certain point, it's like, so what juice does the word retard really have? How much shit do you have to give trans people? What is your big problem with gay people? What's your big problem with women? It's like, hey, what is this, the fucking 80s again? And it's so to me, the problem is that language evolves. Okay. We don't use the word chink anymore. Well, maybe some of them do. You don't use the word oriental anymore. You don't use the word colored anymore. Is that, in a democratic world, people learn to treat other people with respect, communities, and live with it.
Okay, so here he's saying that there's certain words that in the past were widely used that today we don't consider appropriate. And there's a demographic of people who would consider that, woke or controlling speech. As a society, there's a lot of things that we got wrong. And ultimately, ideally, we self reflect, we move on, and we correct. And where we have this tension is where that overcorrection is maybe too extreme or nonsensical. So, not calling somebody the N word or, other kinds of words like that, that seems to make sense for most people. Where we end up with disagreements are certain other words, where perhaps there is a misunderstanding as to why that word might be offensive, or there's like an overreach. Mark is basically saying, okay, you can object to certain things in culture, so you can be anti-woke. Um, but there's like, for some reason, it's only these four things. And I would encourage us to really ask ourselves, like, why is it those four things? Why are those 4 things trending all the time? Are those really the only issues? And so I think Mark brings up something interesting here.
But
Yeah.
I think an outward vocalization of the time. I just went and saw Ricky Gervais at the
Oh,
Hollywood Bowl.
what a bore.
No,
I
brilliant.
loved
I loved it.
All right, go ahead.
Fucking brilliant.
All right.
Fucking brilliant. And he talked about kind of like this on stage. I think this new show is called Mortality. And he talked about, what we are appalled at or what we think is stupid is all about the time. And this is what I'm talking about, our cultural shift. We're not shifting it, it's shifting.
So I'll just cut it off there. But that's an interesting point that Ricky Gervais brings up is like what so much is about the timing. So it's one thing to make, a joke about gay people right now, and I would also argue depends on the joke, but there's certain jokes that, people might make light of gay people in a way that doesn't offend gay people, maybe makes them laugh. I mean, ideally, if you're making a joke about somebody in a particular demographic, like it should make them laugh, right? Just making fun of certain silly things or a cultural thing. We've all heard jokes where it's like they're well intentioned, they're not hurtful, and they do make fun of a certain aspect of maybe somebody's culture. And the thing is, some of those jokes, though, if you made them, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that would not be the response. That would be not be how they land. Particularly, like, say, with gay people, where you were living at a time where you can get arrested and thrown in jail for being gay. Certain jokes were just not going to hit the same way. So, what what you can use in humor and comedy clearly evolves depending on the time and the context. So it has to be contextual. And so I think that's an interesting point.
Look, I think you can say whatever you want. I don't care. I have no, I've been filthy. I've said all the bad things on stage. I've been doing this a long time under the radar in a lot of ways, and I have tried everything. I've done things that were inappropriate on stage. I've said things that were inappropriate on stage, and my experience with people receiving those things and talking to people, and I've evolved the way I present comedy. I think when you talk about Jeselnik, he's just saying that isn't there a creativity workaround that could be funny without creating this juice that just comes from using words that used to be kind of triggering and are less now because the dominant cultural force is now slightly fascistic and leaning towards alienating those voices. So now that we've crossed that hump into what we are now, aren't you just kicking someone when they're down and just being a hack?
Anyways, the final conclusion here is if you're a comedian, don't be a hack. Be actually funny.
Because there is no real progressive pushback anymore. They've won, right? So that side has won. They've won culture, and they've won the presidency, and now you have a lot of frightened people that believe in what was once democracy in terms of respecting all types of people. That's kind of gone. So do you continue along that track of like you being the victim of something, some liberal conspiracy when it clearly is over? I don't know. Look, if you connect all this anti-elitism, anti-Hollywood talk to, right-wing ideology and propaganda, what has happened now is that old-time show business is anemic. It's dead.
Yes.
And so, what's happened is, and in a good way, entrepreneurial way, which is, sort of, your bag, is that, you can start your own show business and you can find your own audience.
Right.
And, that all, seemed pretty good. But if a lot of, and these are comics, if the audience that you build has decided they know what real comedy is, they know that woke people suck, they know that, whatever, scientists are liars. They know that, whatever that the ideological foundation of that audience is, if you're a comic at the tip of that iceberg and you're championing that just by being funny and then, skirting the responsibility by saying like, yeah, I'm just a comic, my fans are my fans, then I think you're being disingenuous or stupid.
So certainly there's been kind of redistribution of media power, media influence. And so it's no longer in the hands of necessarily just, say, the networks or the media outlets. Like there's people on Substack, there's people hosting podcasts. There is, again, a redistribution of influence. So certainly, like a podcaster, for example, can have a tremendous amount of influence. And I agree where it's like you can say whatever you say, I do think there is a responsibility that you have for your words, right? Sometimes you're going to get things wrong. Sometimes you're going to change your mind and what you believe. And to it is important to reflect, especially if you're someone with a very large platform that you've created, where this shouldn't ideally just be about the clicks and the ratings and spewing things. I think it's a good thing that we have more voices or that people can, whether it's somebody who's just really funny or somebody's and makes comedy skits or somebody really creative. Like, there's just so much content today that we can watch and enjoy. And it takes that power of like make it or break it out of the hands of sort of the moguls, the big entities. I think that's a wonderful thing. Like I've discovered hilarious people and singers and artists, all sorts of people. And I think that's great. So they all have influence. There isn't as much of this concentration into just this one big like channel, for example, or TV show. Um, and I think with that, as Spider-Man's uncle says, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that is true. Um, I think it's important for people to be able to express what it is that they believe. I just think that they need to make sure that what they're getting out into the world is A, factually correct, which is a difficult thing. Two, they should be thoughtful in their delivery. And what I mean by that is that, you don't want, you want to create content that makes people think, maybe feel, but you don't want to just inflame people. And there's a lot of that kind of content around. And I forgot what my third point was going to be. But again, there is that responsibility. Oh, I think, oh, yeah, the third point was going to be like what you select to share, right? And I think what we're seeing, and that kind of goes back to an earlier point, is that often we're just seeing very specific things appear in the discourse and the cost of omitting a lot of other really important things. So if you think about, trans issues that are constantly in the spotlight today, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be talked about, but I'm just saying proportionally, like how much do you hear about housing costs, or how much do you hear about medical care, things like that? Are these things like less important? Do they affect less or more people? You know, when you start asking these questions, you realize like there's a disproportionate amount of attention that is being paid to very specific things. And I think that's driven by this like culture war thing, which I think is very detrimental. And again, it's like very specific narratives are being tackled. People have the right to talk about them, but why are we not talking about other things? And I think that's a very important question to ask ourselves and to consider. Anyways, I thought this was an interesting segment, and I found myself actually agreeing with a lot of Mark's points. His delivery is maybe a little bit more curmudgeon, but I think it's worth reflecting on. And I know people will disagree with me on some things. That's totally fine. I think we need to have these kinds of conversations. And, for the most part, I'm constantly seeing people just like either talking to their own side or the other side. And we just really, like the reasonable people on either side of this discourse, we really need to talk to each other and interrogate these ideas, and I think we're going to find a lot more agreement than not. So I was glad to come across this video. It did make me sort of reflect a bit, and I thought I'd share my thoughts, and I would love to hear yours in return.
Don't be a hack.